All right, so are Brits really as stingy as the stereotype suggests? I
Yeah.
mean, you know we've all heard it, right? Splitting the bill down to the penny.
Oh,
It's the
yeah.
insane coupon and that whole cheap as a Scotsman thing. But is there actually any truth to it? That's what we're going to dive deep into today.
Definitely.
And we're going to see if we can uncover some of those cultural and historical reasons behind this pretty persistent stereotype.
Well, and it's funny because those perceptions often do have roots in real things. Like, we have this great article from The Economist.
Yeah, the Economist piece was really
It,
interesting.
it talks
Yeah.
about
You what?
it dives into some of those nuances, right? Like post-war austerity.
Yeah, and even the current cost of living crisis over there.
Exactly, exactly. And it highlights how those tough economic times really instilled a sense of resourcefulness and thrift in British society.
Totally. And I thought it was really interesting how the article kind of positioned frugality as not just a habit, but like a virtue.
Absolutely. It's like it became woven into the fabric of their national character. I even saw one source compare it to the make, do, and mend mentality during World War II rationing,
That's such a good
where
point.
people had to get really creative and resourceful.
Yeah, it makes you think, right? Like how many of us have those hand-me-down items with stories behind them? It's almost like a physical connection to that waste not, want not idea.
Totally. And those values get passed down through generations.
Yeah.
There was this study from the University of York that found that Brits born in that post-war era, they actually have much higher savings rates
Wow.
compared to younger generations.
That's wild. So even when you factor in like income differences, they're still saving more.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing.
Okay, so that makes sense. But here's where I get a little confused.
Oh.
One of the sources talked about how Brits love a good bargain, almost like it's a national sport. So if they're already so good at saving, why are they so obsessed with spending less? Like, isn't that kind of contradictory?
Yeah, good point. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily about hoarding money, though, right? It's more about the thrill of the hunt. It's about being clever
Right.
and outsmarting the system. There's a genuine feeling of satisfaction in finding that amazing deal,
Yeah.
maximizing the value. It's like a game they're playing, and they're really good at it.
Okay, so it's more about being savvy than actually being stingy.
Exactly. The sources are suggesting it's more like a form of financial intelligence,
Right.
a way to make the most of your budget.
I like that, financial intelligence. Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. Splitting the bill,
Oh,
down to the penny. One source even said that calculating those individual shares so meticulously can sometimes come across as, well, a bit tight-fisted.
yeah.
Is it really just being cheap, disguised as being fair?
I think that's where that British politeness comes into play. They're really aware of not wanting to impose on others or take advantage.
Yeah.
So making sure everyone pays their exact amount.
Oh, okay.
It's seen as respecting boundaries and being fair.
So it's less about being stingy and more about just, like, social etiquette.
Exactly. It's navigating those social interactions in a way that feels equitable and considerate. And it's not just limited to splitting the bill either. One of the sources, a cultural study, even said that gift giving in the UK tends to be more practical and value-oriented than in some other cultures.
Interesting. So that whole value for money thing extends to their gifts, too.
Hmm.
Okay, but what about those, like, everyday choices? Like, one source gave the example of someone choosing a cheaper item at the store. Is that being cheap, or is it just being sensible?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Right.
And it really gets to the heart of this whole debate, right? What's stingy to one person might be responsible to someone else. It's all about perspective.
Totally. So is it fair to say there's, like, a spectrum, like, sensible on one end and stingy on the other?
I think so, yeah. And where you fall on that spectrum is going to depend on your own financial values, your upbringing, even your cultural background. The point is, it's not always black and white.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of British financial culture? They're thrifty, they're bargain hunters, but they also have this sense of politeness and fairness. It's confusing.
It is, right. But it's about understanding those nuances. Brits aren't necessarily opposed to spending. It's more about being deliberate and strategic about it.
Okay.
Knowing when to indulge, when to save, and always making sure they're getting good value. Why don't we dive into some examples in the next part?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's get into the specifics because it sounds like it's not just about clutching onto those pounds. There's a method to their madness.
Absolutely. We were just talking about how British financial culture isn't all about pinching pennies. There's a whole strategic side to it as well. One thing that I thought was really interesting in the sources was how Brits approach celebrations like weddings or festivals or even just a big night out.
Yeah.
It seems like they're much more willing to be generous. Th-
Yeah, that totally stood out to me, too. It's like all that careful budgeting goes out the window when it comes to those special moments.
Right, almost like they've got this built-in system for knowing when to loosen up a bit.
Exactly. But does that mean everything we've been talking about, all that thriftiness, kind of goes out the window then?
Not necessarily. The sources, especially a study from the University of Oxford, suggest it's more about aligning their spending with their values. They might be super careful about getting deals on groceries, but then be totally happy to splurge on a memorable experience or a really thoughtful gift for someone they care about.
Hmm, that makes sense.
Brits are just very discerning about where their money goes.
So it's not about being cheap just because they can be. It's more about knowing what's important to them and spending accordingly.
Exactly. And that's where their long-term financial planning comes in. Remember we were talking about how those historical events really ingrained a sense of prudence and planning for the future? Well, one of the sources actually highlighted how Brits are way more likely to save for those big life events like buying a house or retiring comfortably.
Oh, yeah. That makes total sense. If you're always getting a good deal on the everyday stuff, then you're going to have more to put towards those bigger goals in the long run.
Exactly. It all kind of fits together like a puzzle, doesn't it? They're thrifty and love a good bargain, but they're also strategic and thinking ahead.
It's almost like they figured out the secret to having it all. They can enjoy life's fun stuff while still being responsible and planning for the future. Do you think there's something the rest of the world could learn from that?
Absolutely. Especially in a world that's becoming more and more about consumerism and instant gratification, the British model is kind of a refreshing alternative.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's all about being mindful and careful with your money and making sure your spending is actually aligned with your long-term goals. Maybe a little British stinginess wouldn't be such a bad thing after all.
Haha, maybe we need to rethink that word entirely. Maybe it's not stingy, but more like being financially smart, having a healthy relationship with money, and understanding its real value.
I love that. You've really given me a lot to think about. And you know what? Maybe there is a bit of that British thriftiness in all of us. We just need to tap into it.
That's a great point. And who knows, maybe that's the key to being both financially secure and truly happy.
Well, on that note, it looks like we've come to the end of our deep dive today.
We've really covered a lot, haven't we? From the historical roots of these financial habits to the cultural nuances and even debunking some of those stereotypes along the way.
We hope you've enjoyed exploring the fascinating world of British finances with us.
It's all about perspective, right?
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to embrace a bit of that British thriftiness in your own life. You know, it's funny, when we first started talking about this, I really thought we'd be able to just come to a simple yes or no answer about whether Brits are stingy.
Yeah.
But it's way more complicated than that, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
It's like those cultural perceptions we have often don't tell the whole story.
Right.
We kind of lash onto these simple labels and stereotypes without thinking about the history or the values behind them.
Totally. And in this case, what we think of as stinginess is really about being resourceful,
Yeah.
planning ahead, and having this sense of fairness.
Yeah. And one thing that stood out to me was how this approach to money isn't just about looking out for yourself, it's about the community too.
Oh, interesting. What makes you say that?
Well, think about the stuff we've been talking about, like splitting bills so carefully, preferring practical gifts, that whole make do and mend thing.
Right.
It's like they're all about not wanting to be a burden on other people or waste resources.
Oh, wow. That's a really good point. So their financial habits are actually connected to their social values.
Exactly. And maybe that's why we still have that stereotype of the stingy Brit, because it's like two different cultures clashing.
Yeah. So maybe instead of judging them, we should try to understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot the rest of us can learn from this British way of thinking about money, being careful with your spending, thinking long term, feeling responsible for your community. Those are all good things.
I agree. This whole conversation has made me realize that being good with money isn't just about being cheap.
Right.
There's a lot more to it than that.
It's been a really interesting deep dive, hasn't it? I hope it's given our listeners something to think about, too.
Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of that British thriftiness in all of us just waiting to come out.
Maybe that's how we can all achieve financial security and be happy at the same time.
Well said. Okay, so that wraps up our deep dive into the world of British finances. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And remember,
That's all about perspective.
you got it.